Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Cybersecurity Challenges Facing Remote Operators of OT and Other Critical Infrastructure Systems, sponsored by Xona. My name is Carol, author of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Senior Instructor, Bill Moore, CEO and founder of Xona, and Mark Weatherford, Chief Security Officer at Alert Enterprise. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Hey, thanks so much, Carol. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jake Williams. I work with SANS, obviously, that's why I'm here. But I'm joined today by Mark Weatherford and Bill Moore, Xona. We're going to have really a free-form discussion today. Obviously, we've got a couple of slides, but that's more to guide the conversation. These are gentlemen who have all been here, done that, got the t-shirt. And we'll be discussing a little bit about where securing communications and operational technology goes wrong. I know that reading the first slide and being like zero trust, or, oh, not more zero trust. But let me tell you, folks, this is literally like the YOLO approach is what we seem to be doing too much in in OT, whereas we've got a lot of great security in the IT comm side. OT, for whatever reason, folks are like, once the access is there, good to go do whatever you want. We're going to talk today about why that is maybe a little bit foolhardy. But before we get into that, I want to pass the baton over first to Mark to introduce himself, and then over to Bill as well. Mark, take it away, man.
Thanks, Jake. Mark Weatherford. I am the Chief Security Officer at Alert Enterprise, and I've been a CISO 4 or 5 times now in both the public and the private sector. Spent some time at NERC as a Chief Security Officer. So what we're talking about today, especially related to the electricity industry, is right in my sweet spot. So back over to you, Jake.
I'm going to kick it to Bill here to introduce himself. He's the founder and CEO of Xona. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks, SANS, as well for hosting the event. So I'm the founder and CEO of Xona. We really built Xona, really provide a frictionless user access platform that's built for critical infrastructure in OT. My background is, I've been in cybersecurity for many years. Worked at a number of different companies like FireEye and Varonis. But yeah, that's really what we're doing. We'll get into it in a minute.
Yeah, perfect, man. Well, Bill, I think you've got slide control. Take it away.
Okay. So yeah, the zero trust platform for critical networks. What does that mean? I mean, obviously, the zero trust has been used quite a bit. I mean, we look at this very holistically from an entire logical access layer. So when we look at a lot of traditional attack surface threats that are facing enterprises today, one of the things that's missing is sort of this really isolating the critical networks or the critical systems really from the remote user and IT and the internet and so forth. So a lot of if we think about remote access in general or remote operations, generally people think about the legacy jump servers that are put in, VPNs, multi-factor authentication, all of these components, and then kind of an integrated approach. That's worked for many years in the IT world for internet access and so forth. But when you bring that into the OT world, there are a lot of additional issues here, in terms of, not only compliance like NERC CIP and IEC 62443, but really having the ability to have plant level controls, because there's a lot of specific things in OT that are much different than IT networks. In other words, if there's a maintenance window in a control room for a particular system, you don't want somebody remoting into the interface to that system while it's being worked on. So that's just one example. There's also, the ability to understand from a compliance standpoint who's coming in and being able to separate out different OEMs, different vendors and third parties and so forth, right? So you need real granular controls, time-based access controls, very specific roles assigned to different users or groups of users, and then be able to moderate asset access, right? Be able to provide essentially kind of a virtual wait lobby. So even if somebody has the ability to multi-factor authenticate and they have the authorization to go to their particular system, they still need to have somebody on the plan side that says approve. Yeah, they can access this particular system, and do the same with file transfers as well. So being able to really monitor those systems internally in the OT is paramount. Jake, anything you want to add to that, or?
Oh my gosh, yes. I totally want to pull one of these threads here, right? And I want to get Mark in here too. But man, when you said you don't want to bump somebody off, right, who's doing maintenance someplace on a terminal, I want to come back here and look, if you're in the IT space at all, if OT is a little bit new to you, first off, if you're an OT, you know exactly what Bill was talking about. But if you happen to be an IT and OT is kind of this nebulous whatever kind of moment, I want you to think about the last time that you were RDP'd into a server and somebody else RDP'd on top of you and dropped your connection. Or all of a sudden you're like, whoa, wait, what do you mean somebody bumped my connection off? And think about how ticked off you were and how you're like, man, I just lost half an hour of work, right? What you didn't have was an actual physical safety issue, right? You didn't have, the possibility of physical safety issues, physical damage, et cetera. Folks, that's literally what we're talking about here, right? And so just having remote access, right? And this is, I want you to think back to your typical RDP type situation, right? Remote desktop protocol. Think about how many people have access to RDP onto that server. And even then, we still cause IT issues bumping one another off, trying to get on the same server at the same time. Again, I want you to crank the stakes up to, on a 1 to 10, I want you to throw it up to 11, right? When we start getting to the operational technology side, because you don't know in those kind of situations. But Mark, any thoughts around this as well?
Yeah, and it just makes me smile a little bit what you just said, because how many times in the IT world have we done something where like, okay, I'm not really sure what's going to happen here, but we'll just do it and see who cries, and then we'll go back and fix it later, and that's kind of acceptable, I mean, because it doesn't really hurt anything. But in the OT world, where you can actually cause a sensor to stop working, and you like you just said, you can create serious safety issues there that that threaten life and threaten the entire physical infrastructure of the plant or the facility. So it's completely different, absolutely different.
100%.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, it's a good segue, so I can kind of go in to really what we've seen here in a number of different places. So what's interesting in sort of the ICS or OT world is there are still a ton of locations all around the world. I mean, tens of thousands that really don't have remote operations. They're still self-contained. They're still reticent to adopt remote operations. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why is they would have to traditionally, bring in legacy IT. And if you think about enterprise IT, this has really evolved over more than a decade. All of these components, VPNs, segmentation, firewalls, Active Directory, all of these things. And it works very well when you have, tens of thousands of users, hundreds or thousands of applications and so forth. So there's a lot of these pieces that have been integrated together, but trying to forklift this and bring it over into the OT network, it's really too complex. There's a lot of chances for misconfiguration because you don't have the level of IT administrative resources on the OT side. Traditionally, the OT automation and controls engineers, they don't want to spend more than 15, 30 minutes a month really doing any IT related work. So this has become a big problem. And then, you compound that with this complexity is still allowing a data communications protocol to go through, the VPN tunnel and out to the remote user. So this can create a problem if the credentials, if there's been a man-in-the-middle attack, or the credentials either on a remote employee or a third-party device that's remoting in has been compromised. Now there's a method for attack into the OT network. So RDP being the #1 attack vector for ransomware, this is obviously a big problem. And I'm sure, Jake, you have a lot to say about this as well, because this is.
I mean, I don't even know where to start, man. Like, Bill, you are all over this, right? So a couple of high points, because I don't want to steal from future, kind of other slides I know that we're going to talk about here, but a couple of things that you said right off the bat, right? I do not like, as an incident responder, I don't like the idea of all or nothing access, right? Well, as an incident responder, bills by the hour, I love the idea of all or nothing access, right? But as somebody who needs to secure one of these networks, it's a really, really bad plan. So I've got a question here where somebody asks, OT stands for what? That's a fantastic question. OT is operational technology. And so when we talk about OT versus IT, operational technology is the stuff that either receives signals from, so measurements from, or controls stuff in the physical world. All right, so when we talk about SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition devices, you may have heard the term SCADA before. Basically, that's reading, most often reading telemetry, whether it's from a manufacturing device or building control system. Sometimes you have programmable logic controllers or PLCs. We might use one of those to go and flip a relay or open a breaker, for instance. But thousands of different uses. Healthcare technology technically is, patient care technology as technically operational tech as well. And so when you hear OT, just think about stuff that's measuring from or interacting with the physical world. And really, really great question there. Thanks for asking that, because if you didn't know, there's probably a bunch of others that didn't know, and we probably should have started out right with that to level set everybody for what we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, look, as we get into, Bill kind of pivoting back, and now they've answered that question, pivoting back here, that all or nothing access, man, that is some scary stuff, right? And we've seen repeatedly threat actors that have piggybacked, on a support connection, piggyback into the OT environment, and using that all or nothing, folks are like, oh, well, that's an authorized connection, and therefore everything that comes from an authorized connection is authorized as well. This obviously creates a lot of issues because, as I'm sure, Bill, you've experienced, and Mark, you have as well, so many OT networks, they're like a piece of candy, right? They've got that hard, crunchy outside and a soft, gooey inside, right? Lots of legacy devices, right? We still see Windows 2000, Windows XP, Linux from the very, very early days, 2.6 kernels, not at all, uncommon. And so, it's like shooting fish in a barrel once you're in, and that becomes definitely an issue. Mark, I want to kick it over to you, man. Thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think, you're kind of leading to the conversation about the air gap between IT and OT and physical even. And, you still hear people, you talked about this folklore, I call it folklore or mythology of an air gap. But anybody who really understands this knows that they just don't exist. And I'll give you an example. I was interviewing for a job a number of years ago, and the CEO said, hey, I want you to talk to the CEOs of these 3 other companies, and just so they can get a feel for you. So I actually interviewed them. And one of the questions I asked them, these are 3 CEOs of 3 major utility companies. And I said, so how are you guys addressing the air gap within your organization? They said, oh, well, we have these firm air gaps. You can't touch anything. You can't move data. You can't communicate between IT and OT. And all 3 of them said that. And I was just stunned that they really didn't even seem to understand that this was a problem, that it was a challenge. But, Jake, I know that you've seen this, but I talk to people all the time, security researchers and pen testers, and they tell me that that if they can get into an IT network, it's almost 100% success to be able to cross over and move laterally into an OT network. So, when you have guys like you that are out in the field that are doing this every single day, saying things like that, this is the reason why, technology like this is so important.
Yeah, look, when somebody tells me that their IT and OT networks are air gapped, look, I tell them, which is what I dropped in the chat, right? OT networks are never really air gapped. At best, your best case outcome there is you end up with a single undocumented and unmonitored connection between IT and OT. And that is your best case scenario, right? So my typical retort there, providing I've got the right rapport with the person telling me, is I was born at night, it just wasn't last night. Right. So, air gap, that's, tell me a tale, man. So, yeah. Bill?
Yeah, I was just thinking when you're talking about some of the old systems, I just brought up something that I at one site that I remember seeing a system, a little HMI, so that, an HMI is one of the devices that connects to the operational network. And they're generally little computers, and they're usually very old. And this one was
Oh my
Windows
God.
CE, and it would not allow a password more than 7 characters. So we actually were troubleshooting because we were using the word password, and it wouldn't take the authentication, when we were setting up the connection broker on the trusted side. And we finally realized that it just wouldn't accept the eighth character. So when you talked about the GUI inside, that kind of spawned that thought that I was like, these are the types of systems we're dealing with in many cases in OT, and so why they need it. Yeah,
it's funny, Bill, you say that. I just talked to somebody last Friday, and they were running Windows 3.1 on some of their internal HMIs and their environment. So when you think about that, and you think about this old technology that literally cannot be secured, like you just described with password, you have to bolt on and build all of these compensating controls around it that increase the complexity vastly, and add all other kinds of potential vulnerabilities just by trying to add security back into the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me head on to kind of condense this and show you how there's an approach where you can kind of use something that's built for OT to replace all of this complex integrated stuff, and actually something that a plant manager could actually use in the field. And we'll kind of go through this and talk about it. So, and a lot of this dovetails into the NERC CIP compliance, IEC 62443. But this idea of you want to, having an intermediate gateway and having to isolate the OT network completely from the IT network, and that means a protocol break, right? Is really making sure that the protocols that are being used on the OT network don't bleed over into the enterprise IT or into the untrusted internet, right? So, and obviously this new APT alert that came out from CISA last month, it talked about the first 2 things it talked about was isolating the networks, right? Isolating those systems. And the second thing is multi-factor authentication. So these are obviously the 2 big immediate things that you can do to protect your OT network while still enabling remote operations. So in this particular case, when we talk about zero trust, again, we're not looking at this from just authentication or authorization or monitoring or logging and those types of things. We're looking at it. We're looking at all of that, right? So it's really an entire architecture around using all the components of zero trust in the architecture in order to protect the OT systems, critical systems, right? So from this perspective, you have a remote employee or a third party, they're going to authenticate to a critical system gateway here in the middle. And they're going to do that over a web interface. So that's where it really becomes more frictionless, because in many cases, there's a mismatch in access methodology between your company and your vendors or other third parties. They have a different VPN client, maybe one's using VDI, one's using VPN. So this kind of makes it much easier in that making it all native web browser, and then actually using the browser to connect and authenticate, and using hardware tokens that are WebAuthn compliant to connect and authenticate to what we call the untrusted side or the untrusted network. And then that's the first part, right? That's the multi-factor authentication, where you have very, very strong authentication to the intermediate gateway before you get in. Now, typically, you're also going to obviously have the firewall there, to protect that. And the key is only allowing that one port out that DMZ firewall, and that's an encrypted port. So all of the transmission is encrypted on the authentication. And then when you connect, you're using, you're essentially becoming a client proxy to each of those devices. You assign the connection, assign the protocol for that connection, and then assign that connection to the third party or to the employee that needs access to that. So you can be very granular in how you approach that. So these are the key components. And then again, as I mentioned before, you're isolating it and you're only using the spec associated with this protocol, like RDP or VNC, for instance, and you're bringing back only the pixels of the screen back to the remote employee, right? So once the connection is made, you can see the screen, you can operate the screen, but there's no data communications protocol going out to the internet or to wherever the user is, right? So this is that keeps that attack vector minimized to only being on the local area network with the OT devices. And if you got bigger problems if there's somebody malicious in your control room. So that's the key parts of this. And as I mentioned before, moderated access, moderated file transfer, very important in OT. So Jake, I don't know, Mark, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to pull on a couple of threads here, and Bill, I want to get you back in actually to kind of break this out a little bit for us. But real quick, folks, just to level set, like, why is this critical, right? Bill already mentioned CISA and how CISA had highlighted a couple of issues, let's call them, in operational technology networks you may have heard about over the last couple of months here. The big concern, right, is that we are seeing threat actors with malware that is, they are speaking, the malware itself is speaking industrial control protocols, right? So whether it's Modbus or DNP3, right? And if that doesn't make sense to you, if you're not a big OT person, rock on. That's actually part of what this is trying to solve, right? By the way, is you don't have to think about this stuff, right? Your process and control systems engineers, that's what they do. Right. What your goal here is to create that connection so that they can do all the remote administration they need to without simultaneously opening up a path for threat actors, right, to be able to leverage malware that can get into, the OT network. And Bill, if you can explain just for a second here why it was so critical that you have that protocol break between, really, I think it pivots off the CISA kind of notification there, but can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, so really the protocol itself, again, as I mentioned before, RDP, for instance, is one of the main protocols that are used for attacking a network. And I mean, hackers, you don't really need to be that sophisticated. You can go out on Shodan and start just searching for networks, and you'll see networks with these that are using these protocols that are out on the internet. And, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to start poking around and trying to get into these networks and figure out, how to manipulate, and get in network. And this is really, a good example of this, I think, is, some of the recent attacks that we've had, such as the Colonial pipeline and Oldsmar, Florida, that have been in the news last year. So those are typical attacks where, either there was a lack of multi-factor authentication or there was a lack of protection on the protocol, and the protocol was being exposed to the internet. So,
Mark, I'm interested. What are your thoughts around this?
I don't really have anything, I don't think, more to add to Bill. I do like, he mentioned Colonial and Oldsmar. I think Colonial is probably certainly the most recent and most highly visible example. And we talked earlier about how OT systems are often safety critical, and so unless in this case, unless the business can actually prove that OT isn't affected, there's pretty solid rationale for saying, okay, we're going to go to the next step, which is shutting it down to mitigate any further risk. So obviously that's what Colonial did. By the way, I don't know if you saw it, but just this morning, the Department of Transportation, they have I think it's called Pipeline and Hazardous Administration or something. They announced that they were going to fine Colonial $1 million. And, I almost felt like, not to get too distracted by that, but I almost felt like we felt like we had to do something, so we'll give them a $1 million fine, because a $1 million fine, is really not much for a company like that.
But can I pull on that just a little bit, Mark? Because you're right? That $1 million fine's out there, and I don't want to distract us too much with that, but it was really more significant than the dollar figure, right? Because from a relative standpoint, for safety critical incidents, meaning like life safety critical incidents, a typical fine from them is $30,000, $50,000. So $1 million fine for a a cyber attack is not something anybody expected to come out. So myself included.
So, yeah, I agree. But, again, having been in NERC where, if a violation of a NERC SIP regulation can result in $1 million fine per day per violation. And I've talked about this for a lot of years, and it's kind of one of my soapbox issues is, up until now, up until Colonial, the electricity industry and the nuclear power industry, but electricity industry primarily is the only critical infrastructure that had mandatory and enforceable regulations for compliance, cybersecurity compliance. And, Colonial in my mind was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to say, okay, we're going to apply new standards to the pipeline industry. But, we all should be standing back going, well, wait a minute. There's 15 other critical infrastructures out there. What are we doing with them? Not that I'm a regulatory guy and I'm a fan of regulations, but at the same time, these things are going to continue to happen, I think.
Yep.
Okay, that's enough of a distraction. That was my soapbox.
I don't think that was a distraction because it pivots into exactly the other thread I wanted to pull on with Bill. Hand to heaven, we did not rehearse this, right? But the fact that you just mentioned there are other critical infrastructure, other critical infrastructure sectors, and NERC SIP doesn't govern them specifically. Bill, you mentioned Oldsmar. For folks that don't remember Oldsmar by name, because you sit outside the OT space, you may remember last year, Florida water utility is hacked, water dangerous, poisoned, and we all know there are control systems in place that we're going to stop that from getting into the water utility there, or sorry, the actual water supply. Bill, can you opine for a minute on why did Oldsmar, the folks at Oldsmar, why did they ever install TeamViewer on one of their HMIs in the first place?
I think, again, this goes to a lack of resources and that they have to be able to get things done, right? They don't, it's, I'm not going to name any names, but I've seen situations where there's cellular, folks in a critical infrastructure sector use a cellular modem, and set up a hotspot on a laptop so people can get in through their cellular modem and get onto a laptop and, into a critical network because they need to, they have to get in, right? For whatever reason, the person can't get to site. There's a situation that's critical and remote operations needs to be enabled. And so they'll go, hey, it's only going to take 20 minutes. The NERC SIP guy is not going to come around and, give us a fine, right? So that I think that's it. Just the immediacy and just lack of resources is
but that, again, I'm back on my soapbox. There's 15 other critical infrastructures and pipelines are a very small subsection of the oil and gas sector.
Yep.
And there are a lot of these subsectors in all of the other critical infrastructure sectors. So, again, this is the thing that bothers me from a regulatory and a legislative perspective is that that there hasn't been enough focus on making a holistic kind of a play to guide these critical infrastructures. Water is one of the most critical of critical infrastructures, just like electricity, and there's very little guidance around water, around securing water. And when you think of all of these small local and municipal water centers across the nation where I mentioned this story a couple of weeks ago. I talked to a fire chief in a little town in Colorado, and he was running the water station for the city at the same time. So we need more visibility on some of these critical infrastructures for security.
Yeah. Before we move on here, though, I just pivot right back into what Bill has used the word frictionless. At least I was trying to tee him up here a minute ago. He's used the word frictionless at least 3 times here on our slides, and I think that really brings us all the way back around here. And pivoting off of Mark's, example of running the municipal water station and simultaneously the fire chief, which are vastly different things, right? Frictionless is the name of the game, right? Easy is the name of the game. And Bill, you've talked about that a couple of times, man. I think that's one of the huge value props here.
Yeah, I mean, again, you have the resources in enterprise IT to be able to handle your third parties and all of that, but you have to treat all of these folks like they're coming from a similar machine, but yet still have the same or better, actually better security through the authentication. So the key here is the multi-factor authentication, right? Is making sure that when they're connecting, whatever device they're connecting from, they're using strong MFA to authenticate into the OT network, which actually is a good segue into the next slide. So and again, this is the first part about authentication, and I kind of wanted to sort of unpack this a little bit more, because I think this is very important, because I think some organizations are struggling with, well, how do I get down into the OT network and still kind of keep that security, right? And there's a couple of ways that you go down into the OT network. One could be, okay, we're going to have a single sign-on provisioning in the cloud, and then we're going to separate IT, OT through kind of federated identity management, using modern SAML, 2.0, for instance. And so this is sort of IT into OT is kind of in the top level here. But, our mantra here is, okay, you've gone through that, but again, OT is different. They should also have additional multi-factor authentication token to get down. So using, Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, I think it's fine to kind of get your enterprise IT resources, but you want that additional level of protection going down into the OT network. So, we really recommend having physical keys, or at least another type of, some telemetry that's being fed back and forth between OT and the IT federated identity management that provides that level of assurance. So, and then there's the OT only. So there are a lot of assets that are kind of out there that it becomes kind of unwieldy to try to get to them through the IT network, or, for, anything from technical reasons to political reasons. So having ability to go OT only to particular, say, an HMI, at a wind farm or a solar array that's kind of off in its own, has its own network. So that is an example of kind of a self-contained network, but it is a computer system. It still has an IP address, right? Somebody can still plug into it something, so you want to be able to have, very strong authentication to that system, right? So.
Yeah. And something I won't hammer too much on this, because Bill has said the vast majority of why we need MFA and why you're going to have direct OT only connections. Because when I bring that up, people look at me like I have three heads, but Bill did a great job there of explaining, good use cases for that. The thing I want to throw out here, I mentioned it, Mark mentioned it, it's legacy devices, man. They are all over the place when it comes to particularly manufacturing, laboratory networks, right? And these are things that don't natively support MFA, right? So how you get MFA to those devices, right, is that you put a proxy in the middle, right, a device in the middle that's going to handle that MFA for you. And then you make sure that the only thing that talks to that device from a remote access standpoint is the device that supports MFA. That's where Xona sits, right? So Mark, I'll pitch it to you here, but.
No, you were teeing up Bill. I'm going to let Bill take that one. That's right in his wheelhouse.
Yeah, no, that's correct, that Jake. Yeah, I when we were talking earlier about these legacy devices, I mean, a lot of them can't even go long passwords, much less even think about integrating multi-factor authentication on the device itself. So really having that strong exterior authentication and authorization to those systems, I mean, that's really where this comes in. And I think the other thing here is, in a lot of these systems, these are integrated components. If you look at any large plant, whether it's a power plant or a manufacturing plant, you're going to have lots of vendors in there. You may have GE, you may have Rockwell Automation, you may have Emerson, Schneider Electric, right? There's a lot of them, right? And so you want something that's going to be able to connect to any of those systems. And also you want to be able to separate the authentication authorization to those systems so that a Schneider or an ABB or a Rockwell, that they're only seeing their assets, right? They're not seeing everybody else's assets that are on the network. So that's a key part of the authentication authorization process.
That's a great point, Bill. And I think, again, unless you're in the ICS space, you may not really realize that you have all of these different vendors and different vendor components in there, many of them operating on different protocols, sometimes proprietary protocols. You really do need to be able to isolate access between the different vendors, because just like you wouldn't let somebody log into your computer and access all of the apps on your computer, you don't want somebody logging into your network and being able to access all the different physical systems on the network either.
Yeah, that's the central problem with VPNs that are used, to get into these networks, because it's not system authentication or asset. In the words in OT, they use assets, and systems interchangeably. But VPNs are really more network authentication, not system or application authentication, right? So, once you're on that network, you can move east-west, port host scan the network and find systems to start going after. So, that's a big problem in sort of the granular controls that are not there with typical VPNs. And then again, that's usually solved in the IT world with jump servers, but then, with jump servers, you're again, exposing a protocol potentially outside of that network that shouldn't be. So.
Hey, Bill, I got a question for you here coming from the audience. They ask about protocols that Xona supports around this. So once you've multi-factored into the Xona, basically the Xona network, is it just VNC, SSH, and RDP? Well, what protocols do you support from the appliance from there?
Yeah, so those are the main protocols in terms of operating it from a VDI-like state where we're only with the pixels. If you're talking about Modbus or DMP, we do have an additional connection, kind of where we can kind of isolate that protocol for that proprietary connection and enforce that that's multi-factor authenticated, and then be able to monitor, that session as well. So that is, we're seeing some growing interest around that in being able to do that, and we're actually hardening that as we speak and on our development side to provide more hardening around, like kind of isolating that protocol container that's used for that. Now, again, you're not going to be able to necessarily, a lot of these OT protocols don't have as part of the spec the screen itself, to operate. So we have to use the next best thing, which is enforcing multi-factor authentication and making it session-based, so it's not a 24/7 open port on a firewall.
Right.
It's only available during the time period that's specified for that application to use it. And typically, it's a proprietary application on the end user endpoint device that's being used to connect specifically to a PLC. So it's a very specific communication, but we realize that is that's a danger that needs to be addressed. And so we're continuing to work around that area. Yep.
Awesome. Well, hey, I see you've got another slide up here, and I see both access permissions and file transfer being separated, and I love the file transfer directions. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So again, these are systems or even applications that you want to enable access to. So, for instance, all of these are turned on, but you could have only one turned on. So there's only one system that this particular user or group of users needs access to. And then you can decide whether file transfer is allowed on that. And then not only that, but you can decide what direction the file is able to be transferred. So this is a very interesting, for patching systems, for instance. So you want to ensure that no files or data is leaving the network when using the file transfer capability. So you could say to the host is a unidirectional file transfer. And then that means that the file can only be moved to that host system in the OT network, and that no file can move out of that network, right? So that's an additional layer of security. again, these connections, you can have time-based access controls on it. So you can enable file transfer, you can enable it to be unidirectional, and then you can enable it to be a 4-hour time window on, particular date. Okay. So these are some of the controls, granular controls that we have in terms of providing that. Again, there's plant level controls here as well. So on the file transfer, you could enable this, even enable it to be unidirectional, but they can't actually move the file until somebody at the plant approves that it is moved. So that's, again, the plant level control to that system. It needs to be in the maintenance window in order to move that patch file to the system. Again, same thing with moderated access. So even if you're not moving a file, you're accessing that system, you would have somebody at the plant say, I approve this person to actually connect to the system, even though they've been multi-factor authenticated and they have authorization to connect to the system.
Yeah, I can't even for a minute, like, this is so critical. Like I'm kind of in the spot of like, why didn't we have this before? But look, coming back on the IT OT side, folks, if you live predominantly even in an IT environment, think about all the times you wish that you had technical controls around change management, meaning like when somebody agrees for that change window, that you could actually like lock things down and not allow that change window to go ahead until it's planned, right? Again, when you take the possible impacts, the potential impacts of getting this wrong in OT, it's mind blowing to me this didn't exist before.
Yep.
Right, Mark?
No, listen, I couldn't agree more. And, I probably sound like a broken record, but I keep coming back to the difference between, safety and a simple oops and a big oops. You just can't make the same kind of mistakes in OT that we kind of take for granted in IT that are just the course of business.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times in IT I've heard people like, oh, we'll just do a scream test, right? We'll see if we make this change, does anybody scream? And look, in OT, there's no such thing as a scream test in OT, but if there were, it would be a different kind of scream. If anybody for that reckless.
And that's why, to get, I guess, a little bit deeper into it, that's why in some of these big plants, their maintenance window may be, 24 hours every 365 days, or maybe 8 hours every 365 days. And, that's why NERC has to forecast out for years at a time, just based on what the load demands are going to be for the United States, what plants can go down at what time and what's going to pick up the load at that time. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, it's completely different in the OT world.
Yep. So, again, even with the authentication, strong authentication, MFA, and the granular authorization, you still want to be able to monitor, log, and then record what users are doing. So, this is an example of some of the forensics, and this has been really interesting, this feature for us, because being able to have a complete MP4 video file of what a user did when they came into the network, we're finding that there's as much business intelligence that customers like out of this and training and things like that as there is cybersecurity. So it's kind of a multi-use thing with being able to create movie files of what users are doing. Obviously, this is super critical, right? If there is a breach and they can narrow it down to an area of time, you can go back and look at access recordings and see, what happened, right? There might be a malicious insider that's doing something, and being able to have that level of forensics is very, very important.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a forensics guy, right? So this obviously is, I see the obvious potential here, but I want to kick it to Mark. Mark, I can imagine on the regulatory side, this could matter a lot too, where you could prove something didn't happen just the same as you could prove what did.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Anybody who's ever been through a NERC SIP audit, God bless you, because it's a painful process. It takes a long time, but oftentimes an auditor will ask a question and that you may not have a clear answer for, but having the ability to go back and recreate something both time of day and, you know, who did what and when they did it and where they did it. You know, that could save millions of dollars in fines realistically. So, you know, I see incredible value in this, not just for NERC-CIP or for regulation, but think about from a law enforcement perspective, if you're trying to recreate an event, to determine who the bad guys were and when did it actually happen. Did it happen yesterday or did it actually happen 6 months ago? Being able to do this really provides incredible value.
Yeah, and I wanted to add something that another difference between IT and OT that I think cannot be overlooked. In IT, you typically have folks on 40, 50 hours a week, you know, connecting to their systems, accessing systems, working in systems. OT is much more intermittent. You know, sometimes you might not have somebody touch a system for a day, and if they do, it might only be for 10 minutes, right? So these types of things where you're actually recording user access, it may not be practical in IT, right? But it's not only practical in OT, it's doable, and it's easy. It's actually easy to do because of the kind of the intermittent usage. Not only that, but I think that there's a lot of analytics that can be garnered from that. So if you're in a big enterprise and you have 150, 300, whatever, 200 different sites, and you want to say, show me my top 10 sites in terms of who's accessing these sites, you know, this could be an issue where there's a problem child, right, out there that it needs a lot of additional work for whatever reason, right? So, you know, those are the types of operational, efficiencies that can be gained, right, from having that level of visibility into user access. So.
And, you know, and I like that just from the perspective of having more data. You know, we've found as security people, you know, we used to be very defensive in nature, but now we're able to take this kind of data, take this kind of analytics, and actually use it to our advantage rather than just using it as a basic defensive blocking and tackling kind of measure.
Yep, absolutely. So,
oh, go ahead, Bill.
No, go ahead, Jake. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I really can't overstate, like, if you're kind of thinking like, how might I use this? I've got just dozens of use cases that I can think of intrusions that I've worked in the past, and some that were just suspected intrusions, right? Where I'm being asked to prove a negative, right? So some stuff went bump in the night. We need you to tell us for sure there's nothing bad happening in our OT network. And I'm like, first off, that's never going to happen, right? I'm never going to be able to be like, there's definitely nothing here, right? But with this kind of thing, being able to show like what went bump in the night and be very, very specific about what was clicked, when it was clicked, who did it for that matter, because it's all MFA logged. All MFA authenticated, all logged like this. This is just a huge enabler. And I mean, you think about the person hours that you spend investigating and chasing stuff down like this. Again, this is pivotal. It's just pivotal.
Yep.
Yeah, Jake. And I wanted to add, we're also working, from a visibility, asset, discovery, vulnerability detection. While we're not providing that level of visibility, we do work with other IC vendors, and what we're working on, for instance, with a couple is looking at this from a feedback loop. So they discover assets, and then if there's no vulnerabilities with those assets, we bring those in as available connections within our database. But then if there is a vulnerability associated with an asset, we can be notified. So there's a feedback loop. We can make that connection not available. So I think that there's some really interesting things in terms of access control and access analytics to OT with the IC, the IDS, and the vulnerability management and all of that for ICS. Mm-hmm. So a lot of really good synergy there.
Oh, yeah.
So you did mention some of the use cases. I mean, I think that this, I just want to highlight a few here that are kind of interesting. When we talked about, NERC-CIP, but there is one particular power plant that I went to where they wanted mobile operations, because literally they said, hey, we're on a 5-minute SLA. It was a peaker plant. And so most of this is renewable energy that's putting power on the grid. But if they get a call, they need to start up that turbine and get power on the grid. And if they miss that 5-minute SLA, it's $100,000 fine. So this was an example of where we enabled mobile operations around the power plant, because literally they said, we're worried that a guy will go to the bathroom and we'll miss the we'll miss the SLA. But it was, it was more than that. They wanted to do maintenance around the plant and things like that. But that they actually said that was the use case. So I thought that was kind of humorous. But yeah, another area that we're seeing is, and this goes to the lack of resources again, unmanned power plants. This is something that probably wasn't even, dreamed of, 20 years ago. But now, we can enable the ability to bring control room screens back into a larger control room at a larger power plant, and essentially not even have anybody at the other power plant, just watch it from the bigger power plant, right? So that's we have a use case where it's a point-to-point connection, and they're essentially using kind of the VDI capability and multi-factor authentication, everything, in order to bring back those control room screens. And then again, I mentioned the solar array, the system patching. This is not connected to the IT network, and they needed a way to patch the system remotely. So this was an example of that. We're seeing quite a bit of interest in being able to do OT commissioning. So a lot of times these systems, they're during the construction, they need to have a temporary network. So being able to have the ability to, not only connect and operate the networks, but also meet, NERC-CIP, and making sure that, there's a firewall, there's there's the intermediate gateway that we play in that portion, and so we see a lot of that in the energy sector. But Mark mentioned before, these are all kind of energy related use cases. We are seeing a ton of new interest now in rail, maritime, and transportation. We're seeing building automation management. A lot of the buildings keep getting smarter and smarter. So that's a big area. Data center management, kind of the OT part of the data center. So things that you don't traditionally think of as being OT or industrial control systems, they're there in really in every market segment that you can imagine, right? So I don't know, Jake or Mark, if you want to.
I just wanted to quickly talk on the remote OT commissioning, right?
Yeah.
This is huge, right? Because as a threat actor, I would like nothing more to, as you stand up that temporary test network, right, or deployment network, I would like nothing more than to get into the network then and become part of the baseline, right? So the ability to do that securely versus, and again, forgive the term here, YOLO, and with that kind of thing, it's absolutely huge. And look, your auditors on the cybersecurity side are waking up. They're getting a lot smarter about this stuff. I've already seen some questions around that. Well, how is it deployed? And it's like, no, walk me through. Like, how is it deployed? How do you know it was deployed securely? Versus, right, we were like, well, we had it hooked up to the internet, but then don't worry, later we air gap. And we already talked about how ridiculous that term is anyway. Yeah. So, Mark, I'll kick it to you.
I would just say, I think, what you just described, if I'm a bad guy, I want to get in there when you're building the environment, and then I'll just go to sleep for a while until, build my backdoors in and build my own in and out connections. And I'll just wait until this baby comes online, a year or two down the road, and I've got all the access I want. So, having the capability to build a secure infrastructure like during this, the OT commissioning is like really critical.
Well, having been an actual threat actor, I endorse that message. Yes.
Yeah, nobody's watching it.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd leave it last few minutes here for any questions. I don't know, Jake, if you have any coming in, or.
Oh boy, do we have some. So I'm going to start with one that I think is probably an easier one to answer here. They're asking, does the remote user and the OT equipment basically who's doing the TCP handshake, right? Is Xona kind of a person in the middle or man in the middle broker effectively, or is it just a proxy? How does that work at the network level?
Yeah, so we're a connection broker. So essentially, think of it this way: there's a mutual TLS handshake between the browser and us. And when you connect and make that handshake, we'll ask you to, insert your YubiKey, for instance, if you're using that for WebAuthn. We support OTP as well. But yeah, so that's the authentication. The nice part about it is that's happening in the browser on our gateway, so you don't have to have any special MFA agent or plugin in your browser. That goes to the frictionless part of it, right? It's just all standard HTML5 mutual TLS handshake with MFA.
I love this, and I'll tell you another reason I like this is, you talk about simplicity, but I hate having to fight my IT to install another agent, right? If I'm the security guy, I'm like another agent, and I'm like, oh. So anything that you can bring me that doesn't require that and still add security, yeah, and yes. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
I've got another question here of asking about the average file size per minute for session capture. How much storage are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we have a few different flavors of our appliance. One is kind of a virtual appliance that you can assign as much storage as you want, like in an ESX stack, for instance. Or we could do a DIN rail appliance, which is kind of minimal storage. But even that, we really haven't seen issues with storing months of it, because we actually store it as PNG images, and then when you encode it into an MP4 file is when it starts really using up space. So our DIN rail appliance has 64 gigabytes of storage, and then our 1U appliance has a terabyte. So if you want to have onboard storage, but we have an enterprise management solution as well, where it can aggregate all of the video access recordings, and then you can hook that to a NAS or whatever you want, if you want to record everything, or if you have continuous usage. But again, because of the intermittent usage in most OT networks, you're not really, it's not a whole lot of video, and just until you encode it, right, it doesn't take up much space.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical point too. 64 gigs doesn't sound like a lot until you realize, like, that's what a lot of us have on our cell phones, at least, in a couple of years ago, right? And again, to your point, right, you're really the PNGs, and honestly too, this isn't like, 120 hertz gaming at 4K, right? We're talking about driving an HMI that was, previously we were doing over VNC, 8-bit VNC, right? Or 8-bit graphics, right? So this is not high-end graphic kind of requirements here. PNGs compress that pretty well.
Yeah, and the way we're designed, we won't kill the appliance if it fills up the disk. It'll just write over whatever it's most old, and you can just say, hey, we'll keep 30 days locally, but we'll aggregate the rest of it in our central site, right? So there's a lot of flexibility in how you configure that, that storage. So yeah.
So does Xona integrate with any OT SIEMs on the market?
Yes, we do. We have a special connector for Splunk. We utilize our syslog. So if you have McAfee or IBM QRadar or whatever you have out there, we'll work fine with. But we do have a special connector for Splunk that we built.
I love that. Think go ahead, our syslog for the win, because at that point it's everything, right? That's like the skeleton key that opens connections to. Yeah, love it. Yeah. So let's see. I think we've already got a little bit of this answer. I think you hit this a little bit earlier, but somebody's asking here about the protocol isolation and translating sessions to video stream. Can you talk quickly just again about the protocols like S7 or Profinet that don't directly use video?
Yeah. So essentially, if you think about it, there's two parts of access to that critical asset, right? First part is a multi-factor authentication. Once you're authenticated, there's nothing that you can do till you actually either have authorization to connect to that asset, and then you actually have to hit connect to it. So if you're using something other than SSH, RDP, or VNC, we have a connection profile, if you will, called relay, and that connection profile gets configured. You assign, the port number, and that really will accept any TCP or UDP protocol when you use that. But again, this is a session-based connection broker, right? And so it's essentially isolating that connection during that session, and it's enforcing multi-factor authentication as well And then once the session is over, it's no longer there, right? Unlike a firewall where, once you've configured that port, it's there 24/7, right? So,
yeah.
Yep.
Well, awesome. And we've got a couple other questions here. We'll get those forwarded over to you, but this has been fantastic. Bill, Mark, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for bringing this content to the SANS community. I know I learned a lot. I hope everybody else on the line learned a lot as well. Carol, and kick it back to you to close out the webcast. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Jake.
Thanks, Jake.
All right, thank you so much, Jake, Mark, and Bill, for your great presentation, and to Xona for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.